My name is Bill Koglazier. I'm the current chair of the board of the American Friends. This dialogue is the third. We've had two previous ones, and the purpose of the Humboldt Digital Dialogues is to tap into scholarly expertise in the US, Germany, and the global Humboldt network, alumni networks to explore key issues that affect our societies and the world, where scholarship in all fields can help to illuminate. The previous two dialogues, or the videos, are posted on the American Friends website, and there are more dialogues planned for the coming months. So please stay tuned if you're interested. The session today is going to be chaired and moderated by Professor Miles Jackson. He's a member of the American Friends Board. He is the Ernst and Elizabeth Albert Schoenberg Professor in the History of Science in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He explores the intersection of science, technology, aesthetics, history, and society. I think you have his bio, but it's all, his impressive bio is also available on the American Friends website. And before turning it over to Miles, I'd like to mention that we have 75 people registered, so there may be more coming to join us as we go on. I would like to remind everyone to please mute yourselves and turn off your cameras during the presentations, and you can pose questions in the chat. So Miles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's really an honor for me to be able to moderate this, particularly at this time. It's a critical time when dealing with trust and mistrust in science and the elites. So I'll just briefly thank both of our speakers today, Professors Margit Burmeister and Professor Sheila Jasinoff. The idea is that they will each talk about 10 minutes and hold off on questions. Margit, I think, is going first, and then Sheila second. So I'll introduce Margit now, and then when Margit's done, I'll introduce Sheila, and then when Sheila's finished, we can open up questions to the chat. And please, again, put your questions in the chat. Professor Margit Burmeister is research professor at Michigan Neuroscience Institute. She's also the associate chair and professor of computational medicine and bioinformatics, and professor of human genetics and psychiatry, all at the University of Michigan Medical School. She and her lab work on genes that are involved in neurological and psychiatric diseases, as well as behavior in general. Margit, all yours.
Unmuting myself. Well, thank you so much. I'm very excited to hear what everyone else has to say, but it's a pleasure to start this conversation. So scientists and physicians are among the most well-respected professions in the world. During the pandemic, interest in infectious diseases, virology, and immunology peaked, and many blogs and video channels, which started by medical doctors, by scientists, as well as many armchair virologists in social media. I'm aware that the influence of social media is the next dialogue's topic, so I will not comment on those. Because of this heightened interest, the pandemic could have been an opportunity to really increase the trust and admiration of science, as well as scientific literacy. But actually the opposite happened. Now we have to figure out how to restore the prior trust in science instead of being happy about the increase in this interest. There were many missed opportunities and clear mistakes and even lies, at least in the US. While my comments mostly refer to the US, I have traveled to Germany several times during the pandemic and will compare as appropriate. So the first missed opportunity is that science, especially epidemiology, risk perception, vaccine effectiveness, etc., is quantitative. This pandemic could have been an opportunity to train the public better and understand quantitative thinking, but we failed pretty miserably at that. Masks, vaccines, social distancing, etc., were either promoted as working or not working. Specific distances such as 6 feet or 1.5 or 2 meters were considered immutable scientific data, when in reality, they all had their pros and cons and had a specific way of working. Time was barely touched, even though how long you were exposed is a big factor. So I remember being criticized by biking without a mask when the touch at less than 6 feet, when the distance is and the time is so short and the distance doesn't matter in that case. Unfortunately, similarly, vaccines were touted as working, and then suddenly vaccinated folks got infected. So people had to track and say, oh, they they will infect with a much lower risk. But this did not work very well. One analogy that worked well, that was I'm really glad they brought up, is this Swiss cheese analogy that illustrates how mask distancing vaccines are imperfect measures, but provide cumulative protection, although it wasn't quantified. In the US, when we talked about cases and death numbers, by and large, they were given to the public as raw numbers. And the raw numbers were differing by region, by state, by nation. In Germany, they did something very interesting. From the very outset, numbers of cases were reported, but the number on everyone's mind was incidence, which was defined as the case numbers of the last 7 days per 100,000 population. So this number was totally comparable across states, across different countries. And that would have been a very nice way, an easy way of how the CDC could have made discussions a little bit more quantitative in the US. The second part that I think is on everyone's mind is that politics interfered not just with recommendations on things, but also with reporting on scientific facts. There have been many reports about it, so I don't want to spend too much about it, but one thing that I recall from early in the pandemic, the WHO poo-pooed the wearing of masks as serving as a placebo in Asian culture, mixing a put down of a different culture with shunning a measure that actually scientifically had been shown to work and has been used to mitigate infectious diseases for decades. It was politically motivated because they wanted to spare the mask for the medical professionals, but saying they don't work really made it difficult later on to backpedal. Similarly, whether the virus is airborne or not was badly communicated, and any errors in reporting early on were never admitted. In fact, scientists at CDCs were silenced or fired for reporting facts. So that was really a big drawback. Differentiating between what scientific facts are and whether the recommendations take in scientific facts and other factors such as economic and social factors was also not done well. So in the US, booster shots and vaccination of children was promoted while the WHO spoke out strongly against it, not because they don't work, but because they would do more good in other parts of the world. Similarly, discussing the public health of children during the pandemic as a balancing act between psychosocial developmental needs, the needs of working mothers, society, and the risk of physical infection was not done well in the US. In my home state of Michigan, for over a year, most public schools were closed, but bars and restaurants open. This was not scientifically justified. This was totally motivated politically, and that led to vulnerable children falling behind, an increase in suicidality in teenagers, and millions of women falling off the workforce. In Germany, at least, schools were the last to open and the last to close and the first to reopen. In an interest of simplifying messaging, the evolution of science with new data was not communicated well. Instead of, we don't know yet, and we have evidence against this, both were merged into a message of there is no evidence for or there's no evidence against, which is different than saying we don't know versus we don't know that it doesn't work. So some of these messages were then covered up as with new data as an excuse against the lies, with the result that the messaging of the evolution of science was muddled by this political makeup, and it resulted in the public perception that scientists were not sure about anything, and people made the decision to make up their minds about various measures based on dubious resources. examples for that I don't think I want to go into too much details are steroids, hydroxychloroquine, but then on the other hand, vitamin D, which is a harmless vitamin that was, if for many MDs touted vitamin D as a potential protective and was shut down, when in reality, whether it works or not is not a big deal, because it's certainly an innocent drug and a measure that is much less harmful than, for example, hydroxychloroquine. Lastly, the biggest missed opportunity, in my opinion, is that the fast development of highly effective vaccines and drugs could have and should have been celebrated as a major triumph of science. But even these became very politicized. The US government had paid for the development and early production of some of the vaccines, but the company that produced the most common one, Pfizer, refused this public funding. And so the celebration of the government that the government would have liked to do didn't work for that particular one. And very few in the US even knew that Pfizer was contracted for trial and production of the vaccine by a small German company, BioNTech, that was run by a Turkish immigrant scientist couple. Nor do many in the US or anywhere in the world know that the name of the Hungarian immigrant woman scientist, Katalin or Kati Karikó, who was behind the invention and holds the patent on modification of RNA that allowed these mRNA vaccines to be made. We should celebrate persistence and the long path from basic research to finally having life-saving applications, the role of women and immigrants in this development, rather than fighting whether the government paid or not for these vaccines. They clearly have made a huge difference. So same actually with the drugs. I mean, we have not really celebrate the fact that we now have some very effective drugs against COVID-19, even though right now they are very, very scarcely available. So sadly, this true triumph was also overshadowed by a lot of negative. So in the end, we have a public that used to trust scientists and medical doctors, now disillusioned by the many contradictions, mixed messages, outright lies of officials, and many top articles in journals are now talking about how can we restore the trust in science. And I'm really curious if we can get to that part of how to restore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And now it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Sheila Jasinoff. Sheila is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's written many, many critical works that have influenced my own work, just to name a couple: The Fifth Branch, which deals about concept of regulatory science, Designs on Nature, Science and Democracy in Europe and the United States, and Science at the Bar is also a classic work. She's edited or co-edited a number of critical volumes as well. And just to name two of the many prizes that she's received, she's won the Bernal Prize from what we call the 4S, which is the Society for the Social Studies of Science, and the Albert O. Hirschman Prize from the Social Science Research Council. So Sheila, over to you.
Well, thanks for that generous introduction, and thanks to Margaret for offering, one point of view on this discussion that we're having, and very much opening it up to the dialogic format, because I think that the conversation will illustrate a way that I've come to rethink the story of the blind men and the elephant. I've come to think that it's not that the blind men were blind, it's just that they were trained in disciplines, and the disciplines allowed them to look at the same elephant, but to see very different things. So, perhaps the one who saw the tail as a rope was a rope maker by profession. And sometimes we feel that we in academia are a little bit ships crossing in the night because we're bringing our own different perspectives to bear. So I, if you'll forgive me, would like to share my screen and just walk through a different point of view on what this malaise is about, and then hopefully open it up to interesting questions and answers from the audience. So Sorry, it's always a problem these days with Zoom, which screen one opens onto, but here's the thing. So I was very pleased to see that the title of this presentation was, or this dialogue was Mistrust in Science and Elites, because as I think Margaret's intervention pointed out, a lot of the time people are talking about mistrust in science per se, but I think saying elites underscores that we're talking about social formations and the loss of trust that is much more pervasive than science, but equally that suggests that the solutions are not to be found within science, that it's not just a matter of how you communicate the specialist knowledge that scientists have in a more accessible form and so on and so forth, that there's a wider problem here at work and at stake. So I think that one should put the elite distrust and the scientific distrust into conversation with one another. So accountable politics is something that has occupied political theory for thousands of years in the West and also in different ways in other places. So for instance, in India, there's a highly developed tradition for what rulership is about and why one should trust the sovereign and the king. And it's not necessarily known in a tradition that takes itself back to Plato, for instance, but there is a key question that people ask about democracy, and that is, why do we have a system in which very few people rule very many people, and how would we go about answering this question? But equally in modernity, we have a question that is less often explicitly posed, and that is, when should the few be authorized to know for the many? And that, I think, is the fundamental question to put on the table when we're discussing the sort of loss of trust. That is, perhaps we have forgotten how best to answer that second question. One very common answer is transparency, and with it, communication. I mean, so the Washington Post adopted not that long ago its motto, democracy dies in darkness, and hand in hand with that is this idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that what we need to be is open. And scientists themselves have translated this into an obligation, a self-reflection on their part about communication, which Margaret mentioned, that we have to get better at communicating what science does. Often this translates into numeracy, that if we could only teach people how to understand probabilistic figures and so forth, then we would be somehow home free. But, it's worth each of us asking, when is the last time we did something because of the numbers? I mean, I can assure you that in spite of being a fairly well-known scholar in science and technology studies, I did not go to get vaccinated because of numbers. They pretty much did not enter my calculus. Some other things did, so we can talk about that. So another thing to note is that we live in societies where there is a going assumption about the public, not that it is ignorant, that it doesn't understand numbers, that it needs to be led by the hand, but rather that it is what I call knowledge able. I mean, that is capable of taking on board knowledge. And the evidence for that is that over decades, we have constructed a system of rules and laws in all of the countries that I study, and these include Germany, Britain, France, the US, and to some degree, India. And these things that I call epistemic rights include a whole variety of right to know provisions, the right to give informed consent in biomedicine, the right to ask for reasons under various administrative regulations in all these countries, the right to participate and offer expertise widely recognized in most modern societies, the right to challenge decisions because they're irrational or because they're not founded on good data, and the right to appeal judicial fact-finding rulings. So all of these things form a huge pillar of legislative and regulatory entitlements that together add up to a presumption that something like the Jeffersonian citizen is more the citizen and not the ignorant citizen who doesn't understand. Informed consent would mean nothing if we assumed that people are not capable of judging the risk to themselves. And yet there would be screams reaching up to Mars if we said, let's yank away informed consent because the doctor knows best. I mean, that is just not a feasible direction to go in. And so all of this leads me in my theoretical work to say that science today plays a constitutional role in democracy. It's often hidden, but science does exercise power through processes that we are not often explicitly aware of, that polities carry around with them tacit theories of science, what I call public epistemologies or civic epistemologies, that these are visible in political contexts, that these include claims about the universalism and infallibility of science, but different other theories for the ways in which science and technology relate to society. These are tacit theories, but they become evident when people talk about science in public. One very important place where science plays a constitutional role is that we understand delegation when it comes to political rulers. We can all spout out what an election cycle looks like in our respective countries and how we can call people to account. Everybody in America has some vague understanding of what impeachment is, even if they don't quite know what it is. But with regard to science and scientists and experts, we do not have that understanding in an explicit way. And Miles was kind enough to mention The Fifth Branch, but that book appeared in 1990, and in it I explored these understandings of delegation that are abroad in the expert committees that are operating in Germany and the US, but in most other countries as well. And then there are ad hoc and generally unexamined principles of accountability that relate to policy expertise. I mean, so when do we get to challenge a ruling? How do we open something up? What does closing down consist of? I mean, so how many people in this group know the Chevron decision, which is a pillar of the American administrative state and the most cited decision, I think, of the Supreme Court at all, but it's a dry administrative decision, and yet it relates to this question of when do we close down debate on policy expertise. It is not a household fact that is known to even this particular elite that is joining this conversation. And what are the procedures for public participation? I mean, do people know that France, for instance, has constitutional ideas for how people must be brought into dialogues on sustainability, that this is actually built into the French Constitution now? All right, furthermore, we keep saying science, but, what is science and when is it science? I mean, this is a typical thing to talk about in the dialogue, so I won't dwell on it. But Miles, again, you were kind enough to mention regulatory science. I mean, it was not really on the books as a particular branch of science, but you can talk about science generated for purposes of law and, advocacy science that civil society produces and litigation science and citizen science. And now I want to put up a controversial quote, because what I want to argue is that everybody in our societies has some idea of what they mean by science. And we can say all we like about this particular gentleman who has occupied an outsized role in our lives, but, note that when he says various things that, one may only, tear one's hair out about, the appeal is being made to science. So I would like you to speak to the medical doctors to see if there is any way you can apply light and heat to cure. If you could, and maybe you can, maybe you can't. I mean, you could say that there's a nice scientific spirit of experimentalism abroad in that quote, a deference towards this thing called medical doctors that Margaret already referred to. And maybe you can, maybe you can't. I mean, isn't that the experimentalist's attitude? Let's run the controlled experiment and see, maybe you can, maybe you can't. I mean, so, even the most benighted positions in society already have some understanding of how science works. So what do I think we should do with democracies? Not give them more mathematics, because I think there is a lot of evidence that there is no linear relationship between knowing more quantification and understanding or respecting, let alone celebrating science. Rather, I think that democracies need to be enabled, even more than they are, to be more critical, to ask the right questions. And here is a series of little questions that I think are pretty important. And if these were answered well, then I think that there would be at least a way of determining who should we trust and who we shouldn't. So not asking, what is it we know, but on what authority, the third bullet, would allow us to distinguish between well-founded and ill-founded kinds of claims. Then you might have to teach people about process, you might have to teach them about peer review and when it works and when it doesn't work. But these are things that one should be literate in if one is living in a scientific society. And it's a shorter order, I think, to teach these questions than to assume that everybody is suddenly going to go around, knowing whatever one thinks is the minimal package of things that one should know. I was a math major in college, and I can tell you my math is pretty rusty, but I think I can still function as an enlightened citizen in a scientific and technologically advanced society. So with that, let me stop the screen share and open it up or throw it back to you, Miles.
Sheila, many thanks. Many thanks again to both of you, Margaret and Sheila. I remind everyone, please, because we have a large number of people, if you have a question, please type it in the chat and I'll read it. I guess for those that, that are thinking about their questions, I thought I'd start out by the first one, which is, given the rather complex and historically contingent relationship between various forms of science and their polities, there are obviously various types of expertise, and Sheila was getting into this when we mentioned about the elites, various types of forms of trust, various forms of what counts as evidence. And so I guess my question to both of you is that, given the various forms of trust and expertise, which are always at play at any particular time between the relationship between science and society. My question is, I'm interested in individual agency when it comes to vaccines. And I think, Sheila, you were mentioning, why in the world at the individual level is someone going to get a vaccine? Whose expertise are they following? Clearly, it's going to be dependent upon regionally, but I mean, is it the expertise of the scientist, the doctor, or in some cases the physician, or sorry, the local religious authority, right? So I'm interested if we know anything about kind of a detailed look, an atomized look at the types of reasons why people go for vaccination, and I think most are right. I mean, it's not because I look at the numbers, there must be other reasons behind that. And with that, I'll stop and be quiet.
Margaret, do you want to go first?
I opened the chat instead of the mute. So my opinion is, and I think there's some basis over there, that it depends, that different people trust different authorities. And I really liked your idea of thinking on whose authority. I know that in the US, at one point they decided to give vaccinations on Sundays after services in Black communities through the churches, because the trust came through as you said, the religious authority. I think other scientists go by the numbers. I think most of my colleagues basically went purely by what their estimate of the numbers were. And from what I've heard is, in many cases, people still trust their own home physician that they have had for many years, and went by that. So I don't think there is a single answer on whose authority it is, but I'd really be interested to know what Sheila is saying about that. So my answer is it definitely depends on what your own world outlook is on all topics.
So, I certainly, Margaret, agree with you about the multiplicity of ways in which trust is built, and that for different people, it's different things. I wonder, Miles, if the question shouldn't be turned around in a sense. I mean, so you give people a fearsome disease and they don't know when they're going to contract it, and then you tell them, well, there's a vaccine. there is a predisposition to want to immunize oneself, even to whatever degree, if it's an improvement over the uncertainty and over the seclusion and the isolation. Plus, a vaccine isn't a novelty, right? I mean, the COVID vaccine may be a novelty, but it comes against the backdrop for all of us that we went through childhood immunizations and boosters and so forth. I mean, this is a known entity in our cognitive and epistemic world. So I think it's more interesting almost to flip the question and say why one would distrust. And then it turns out that we know a great deal about that we know that it's about institutions to some extent. It's not about, this isn't, fancy French theory and the vaccine is an actant and we have a relationship with it and it's the materiality that we take into our body. I mean, one can get fancy about it, but if you think that the medical establishment has purposefully passed you by, has used your body for purposes other than healing purposes, if that is your attitude, then you can legitimately be skeptical. Also, in America, if you think that there is a hand-in-glove relationship between the academic elite and science, and that this is tied to big government, that has been a very important factor promoting skepticism in America. And we know that even Trump has got into trouble with some of his core constituency by seeming to line up on the wrong side of the affiliations with regard to vaccination. And he's blown hot and cold. Is he going to trumpet the success of Operation Warp Speed? Or is he going to sit back with the 25% or so of his constituency who thinks that vaccines are a further invention by which big government is trying to spread its tentacles into the free American society? So, I think that one has to put the word institution into the discussion, that this is not just about individual people, that elites themselves are a form of institution in society, and elites have distanced themselves in America from the polity in a way that this is not the case in Germany. I mean, so this is a place where cultures differ to some extent.
Thank you, Sheila. Questions? Megan, I wasn't sure if that was a question. The skepticism that for a for-profit health industry has the best interests of the public at heart, she writes. I'm not sure if that's a question or skepticism.
Question. It was the connection between government and health is a source of suspicion, but also the connection with the for-profit health industry, I think, is a big source of suspicion for many people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a source of support. I mean, let's not forget that things like the constant gardener have a role in our mental lives as well. I mean, why is it that when John le Carré stops writing about the Cold War, a phenomenon of interest to the two sides in this dialogue, he goes to the pharmaceutical industry as one of the sort of big devils. We have the opioid crisis and scandal. I mean, it's a very appealing public villain, the organized medicine and the pharma industry in particular. But there's also a phenomenon that one has to keep in mind about how science progresses. And this goes back to what Margaret said earlier about the seeming flip-flop on the mask mandate, that, people say one thing, and then it turns out the next day is, that we need to modify it. So this is something worth dwelling on. I remember that when people were first getting their vaccinations, the word invincible came into public discourse. So people were very proud of the fact that they had, we had faculty meetings in the Kennedy School where people were chatting before and after, but even during the meeting, oh, I'm getting vaccinated today. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't attend this meeting except on my phone because I'm driving down to be vaccinated. So this was like a point of pride, and people were saying, I am becoming invincible. So how many of us know people with breakthrough infections? I know several. So invincibility quickly gave way to, okay, but there are variants. And so the vaccine is specific to variants. That's not the way it was sold, right? I mean, it was sold as this is going to make you invincible. I haven't done, this is where quantitative analysis might be helpful. I haven't done that quantitative analysis, but I think that, you know, for people who started out hesitant, the story that there was overpromising going on and that it doesn't really work as well as maybe my body's natural immune system or herd immunity or whatever, it's not hard to find data points to support your misbelief if you want to. And that, I think, is something that the sales pitches and the industry have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Bill. Bill asks, based on spending 17 years helping to oversee the studies of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, I believe that the academies attempted to answer Sheila's question, yet that was not always sufficient to build trust. So a question for Sheila, what is your view on the impact of politics on trust?
So I think one should take the word impact out of these discussions. When I first joined Cornell as a fine positivist lawyer trained in environmental law, I joined the program on science, technology, and society, where the core course that was being taught was called the Impact and Control of Technological Change. And over the decades since then, this was back in 1978, over the decades since then, I've learned that the relationship between science and politics is not of science and technology sitting apart and having impacts, but rather that these enterprises are political all the way through, but maybe political in a more subtle sense. I mean, political does not mean that power distorts knowledge. That it's shapes and is shaped by, that is a truer formulation. But then we need to study exactly in what ways those things happen. So, you know, academy studies, I mean, I've served on numerous committees myself and been involved in various reports. I mean, first of all, I'll tell you that the American public at large, including my Harvard students, don't have a clue what the national academies even are. I mean, so the other day I was talking to a very distinguished colleague at Harvard, faculty, who had no idea of the difference between AAAS and NAS or NASA. So, you know, just that level of literacy about how do we construct public knowledge is sorely lacking, you know, even among our nation's elite of the elite. So then you get into the nitty-gritty details, and, you know, my good friend and colleague Steve Hilgartner has written a book about the construction of authority by the national academies, which simply bolsters and puts forward the fact that when people speak to audiences that are internal among their own group, the in-group dialogue looks different from the out-group dialogue, and there's a discrepancy. There's a discrepancy in how certain you make knowledge seem. So the national academies are not immune to that sort of doublespeak in a sense. And you can say that, well, it's essential for a society. A doctor telling a patient something should not reveal every doubt in the doctor's mind or whatever, but at least it becomes a different kind of question. So, you know, the academies do their thing totally hand in glove with politics. The NRC, the National Research Council, is there to answer to politics. So, you know, I think one has to get more subtle and give the public credit for understanding subtlety. That's, you know, something that I would suggest we should think about and talk about more.
Thank you. Then a question from Dana King. For both of you, the idea of informed consent and issues with communicating the evolution of our understanding of COVID brings up to me if there is a possible harm and or a reinforcement of elitism in merchandising social media statements along the lines of "I believe in science." Question.
I mean, to me, this question, and actually the one after, which is how much is the message about invincibility a result of the way that journalists habitually report how they frame controversial issues. I think both of these go into it. Science isn't yes or no, it's a process. It has numbers, it has risks, and as long as we put it into the idea of, okay, I believe in science, as Dana says, or this is a yes-no issue, that you should do this, you should not do this, rather than bringing the truth, which is sort of in the gray between, where yes, there are certain risks to vaccines, but they are very, very small compared to, for most people, compared to the benefit. And the benefit, as Sheila was addressing earlier, isn't it works, it's 100%, but it reduces risk of death, it reduces risk of the infection. So I think we have to be more honest, and we in this case mean scientists, but also, as Dr. Hagland says, journalists, people, the media should go away from this yes/no answer.
So, it's so common in scientific circles to end up with a little bit of, I won't call it media bashing, it's not quite that bad, but, science journalism, which is a field that I've had lots of intimate dealings with. The night program for science journalists is down the street, and I periodically go talk to them. Science journalists are often themselves scientists marqués. I mean, they have science degrees, they were trained in science. It's not like science journalists are the advancing frontier of the great unwashed who look at science and say the wrong stories. It's often quite the contrary, that they have imbibed the very same boosterism that scientific groups and communities themselves want to convey to the public. Most of these sort of biographies, I mean, think of Walter Isaacson writing about Jennifer Doudna, to take a very recent biography. Is that, I mean, the man shadowed Doudna for a very long time. This is based on intimate, almost ethnographic knowledge of what the work is like. And yet it's a celebratory piece that, to some extent tracks the hyperbole of Doudna's own book, A Crack in Creation. I mean, so, it's scientists, I'm sorry, it's not a humble profession, even though it's a humble activity. And the activity is humble for good reasons, the same reasons that pragmatists thought democracy was a humble activity, that we advance not in leaps and bounds, but through experimentation of what works and doesn't work. I mean, this is the spirit that's lodged in the idea of the 50 states of the United States being experiment stations for democracy, because, an Oregon may do one thing with healthcare, or Massachusetts may do one thing with healthcare, and then it becomes potentially a model to be applied more widely. So I think that this point that there is a disconnect between the ways in which scientists speak among themselves about what they're doing, and with really difficult consequences, for instance, in ClimateGate, which happened at the wrong moment. It happened conceitedly politically motivated, in all likelihood, right before the Copenhagen summit in 2009, but it derailed discussion until 2015, when the Paris summit happened. So, these are sort of consequential disconnects. And I think that, the sort of being true to oneself as an institution may require, I mean, this is about the march and the, we are marching for science, that kind of attitude that's reflected in one of these questions. But, I do think that it's well to remember that the media ultimately are getting their stories from somewhere, and the somewhere is right in the heartland of science. It's not from somewhere else. It's not that the media have this celebratory instinct. Yes, they have ideas of what is a story. I mean, man bites dog and not dog bites man. But, that's a different thing. I mean, scientists are taught to feed those stories.
And we have a question from Chris Gates. Re-subtlety, in your perspectives, is the tension between scientific accuracy, precision, and simplicity an essential attribute of, or more of a cultural construct? I.e., do other citizens of countries appear to accept, tolerate subtlety, complexity differently?
In my research, what I've found over and over is that the degree to which science is considered an institution apart from the rest of the functioning of society is one place where societies differ. And I'll give 3 examples. So in America, there's this idea that scientific institutions can govern themselves, purify themselves, establish their own power. The very fact that the National Academies occupy a place on Constitution Avenue in DC is, to me, a kind of symbolic and spiritual reinforcer of that kind of attitude. There is a very interesting report that the National Academies did on climate advice. This is a number of years ago. And they blamed Germany, my second example, for actually having expert commissions advising Parliament, where the experts were chosen in proportion to the representation in Parliament. And the National Academies, the US National Academies report, took the German Parliament and its enquête commissions to task for having a politically loaded committee structure. But I've not heard anything like the vociferousness of debate around scientific issues in Germany over years and across many sectors that one hears in America. The debates are there, but they're debates about governance. They're not debates about the truth value of the scientific propositions. And then if you turn to India, you have yet a different situation, because in India, the civil society belief, at least as documented by the organizations, is profound distrust of expertise that is coupled to a distrust of government doing things in the interests of people. So you have lots and lots of dissident scientists who work for civil society groups because they believe that government is a source of obfuscation, concealment around questions like nuclear power, not revealing the toxic effects of industries on the immediate polity. So, distrust is the place out of which, in a way, a more robust democracy has arisen, at least in the Indian context. So these are 3 different settlements, as I call them, and they go back to different ideas of the institutional relationship between science and government and what people take to be the ideal there.
Many thanks. Perhaps one last question, because we want to give time for our speakers to have a final say. So from Andre Plaza, what are the most important ways forward for increasing trust in science? Media training for scientists, scientific method education in middle schools, training public stakeholders in scientific education, ...
I mean, my answer to Andre, well, there are many answers. I do agree with Sheila that many times it's the scientists pushing the journalists to be more simplistic and sensitive and sort of glorifying than is justified by the data. Totally, that's the case. So I think one possible way that is being discussed among scientists is to have more scientists going into politics. I do believe that the fact that Angela Merkel is a scientist played part of the role that Germany did relatively well in the beginning of the pandemic, and she was credited with this. And I think her coming from a scientific training made a difference. It's really appalling that there are very, very few. I think there's only one PhD scientist, if I'm not mistaken. At least that's how he sells himself in Congress. So I do think it's not just education at the school level, as it's also, I think, bringing scientific thinking more into politics, because it seems the two were very much opposed during this pandemic.
Yeah, so I will answer from a different part of the elephant. I don't think it is about making more scientists, making more people into scientists. I mean, of course, the quality of education should be improved. And in America, we do a desperately poor job because of the way in which we fund education and because of the ways in which we undermine public education writ large. So we don't have a very highly educated or sophisticated polity, but it's our own fault because we run a bad democracy. So, you know, in many respects, it's good in some respects, obviously. But, you know, I think that the long-standing observation that science does well where democracy does well is worth remembering, because it does suggest that the causal arrow might be turned around and that we shouldn't be focusing so much on the goodness of science as on the goodness of our public life at large. And I'll say a word about Angela Merkel. You know, why do we want to say she did well because she was a scientist? I would say she did well ultimately as a long-standing Chancellor-in of Germany, maybe just as much because of her Protestant theological background. And if Angela Merkel is remembered in history for a long time, it will not be because she was scientistic about running the government, but because she took a very unpopular stand on immigration. And, you know, it did her political damage at the time. But in terms of historical stature, I think that sense of charity that this woman brought into a debate at a certain point is, to me at least, more important than, you know, any of the other single things that she did, because we are global societies. We have to be somehow citizens of a global order, and a sense that the rich have something to give to the poor and should. That, I think, did not come out of her scientific training. It may have come out of her East European experiences, but for sure it came from her family background and her, you know, embedding in a long-standing religious culture with values attached to it.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, so we just want to leave any time for Margaret and Sheila to wrap things up.
I mean, one thing I'll say about elite education, I mean, I fell into science and technology studies completely by accident. But over the years, and now I'm talking about more than, well, just about exactly half of my own life, I have become persuaded that one of the things we need to do is provide that training, that this should be part of education for certainly the kinds of elites that we represent. And we're far from there in American universities. We do not have required training in the relationship between science and society. A basic course in the history of science within our own political systems. I mean, I constructed such a course when I was at Cornell. I called it Science in the American Polity. And it is not taught at Harvard because there's no vehicle through which to teach it. The history department wouldn't hire somebody who does that. And I think that this is something that needs to change. I think that we need to see science and technology as part and parcel of what we're doing. And I would like to do a shout out to the Technical University of Munich, which has just recently, as of late last year, established a department of science and technology studies. And I think that this sort of thing has to become far more universal, and STS has to become part of the baggage so that everybody, both scientists and non-scientists, learn to understand more deeply that this is a cherished set of institutions in our society, science and technology, but that the trust is in the relationship and not in the thing itself. And, you know, so that is a message that I would like to, you know, end with.
Margaret?
Hard act to follow. I definitely agree with Sheila that the having institutions that meld the two, that democracy improvement may also improve science, definitely will help. I do still believe that better scientific training will be useful and will be helpful. And I actually am now what they call a faculty fellow in public engagement. And I do think that training scientists to speak better to the public and training politicians to understand science better. And the course in Munich sounds exactly along those lines, that science right now is something where people say all the time, oh, I don't know anything about math, I don't know anything about science. But if someone says, I don't know anything about Shakespeare, or I don't read books, then that is really saying, like, I'm uneducated. But someone saying, I don't know anything about science is a totally acceptable stand. And I feel science should be more part of the sort of what is known as a general education. So I hope to do a little bit towards that in the future, and I hope that may make a difference. But I don't totally agree with Sheila that that's how it works in a democracy, and how we don't have scientific establishments behind the scenes pushing politicians. That's also an important part.
Okay, so I should end by first thanking the Alexander von Humboldt and American friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for putting this together, and there will be more in the future. So keep a watch out. I'll get this English sentence out on the website. And many thanks to Margit. A pleasure meeting you virtually for her participation, and Sheila. Many thanks to you. Great seeing you again, albeit virtually. And many thanks to everyone for attending. Hope to see you anon back here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great listening to you. Really.